Imagine walking into a glittering royal court where chandeliers drip with candlelight, jewels gleam on every robe, and whispers fill the air like smoke. To the outside world, this is the theater of elegance, a place where power and beauty intertwine. But hidden beneath that dazzling surface lies a cruel stage where kings bend not just the laws of the land, but the very bodies and souls of those closest to them. The court was not merely a place of music and poetry, it was an arena where loyalty was tested in ways no one would dare to imagine, where affection was never enough, and submission had to be proven through humiliation. In a world where a monarch's word outweighed the scriptures, an intimate relationship could quickly turn into a grotesque performance designed to amuse, reassure, or simply feed the insecurity of a man who already possessed everything. Power has always been a paradox. The more someone has, the more they fear losing it. A king who commands armies, who sits on thrones carved out of marble, who has his face stamped on coins, still lies awake at night wondering if the woman beside him truly belongs to him, or if she merely smiles out of duty. And so, he demands proof. Not tender proof, not loving words, but acts so absurd and often degrading that even centuries later, they sound like twisted parables. It's almost comical in its cruelty. Imagine a man who controls entire kingdoms yet still feels threatened by the possibility that someone else might hold his mistress's heart. The insecurities of kings, it seems, are just as fragile as those of ordinary men, only expressed with far greater consequences. If these hidden truths from history made you reflect, imagine what still lies untold. Subscribe now and join us in uncovering the stories that power tried to bury. Take, for example, the lavish banquets where courtiers applauded every word from the throne. Behind the laughter and the clinking of goblets, women were sometimes commanded to demonstrate loyalty in front of the same audience that bowed before them. What was supposed to be intimacy became a stage play. Imagine being forced to turn your private devotion into public theater, your dignity served up like dessert after the main course. And the courtiers, those ever-watchful sycophants, would smile and clap, because what else could they do? Power was theater, and to refuse to applaud was to risk your own head. It makes you wonder how many polite nods in history were actually silent screams. There is something deeply unsettling in realizing that many kings did not separate the personal from the political. For them, love itself became an extension of power, another territory to conquer and dominate. A mistress was not simply a woman, but a living emblem of submission. To possess her was to remind everyone else that even the most private corners of life were under the king's command. And if she resisted, then the so-called proof of loyalty would be demanded again, harsher, more humiliating, until she either broke or learned to act convincingly. There's a bitter irony in all this. These men sought proof of devotion, but in their insistence destroyed the very thing they craved. After all, how genuine can loyalty be if it is forced at sword's edge? Yet history has a way of mocking its own players. Some of these kings, convinced of their brilliance, ended up becoming the butt of whispered jokes in their own courts. Servants and scribes, though careful to survive, often left behind records laced with a certain dry humor. They saw the absurdity of a ruler who could demand a new law with the flick of a wrist, but still quaked at the thought of being unloved. In that sense, kings weren't much different from jealous husbands in tiny villages, except their tantrums shaped the lives of nations. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That wars might have been launched, policies altered, and alliances broken not because of strategy, but because a powerful man was sulking over an imagined betrayal. The more one digs into these stories, the more one feels torn between horror and a strange urge to laugh at the tragic comedy of it all. The court, with its golden ceilings and velvet drapes, was often nothing more than a stage for childish games played with adult consequences. Kings wanted to see loyalty demonstrated like a circus trick, forgetting that true loyalty is quiet, invisible, and requires no audience. But try telling that to a man whose crown weighs heavier on his ego than on his head. Power doesn't soothe insecurity, it magnifies it, and those caught in its orbit, especially lovers, became unwilling participants in experiments of control. And so, what might have been, whispered vows and candlelit chambers turned into grotesque trials. Women were asked to degrade themselves, sometimes in front of others, sometimes in acts that violated their own beliefs, all to feed the bottomless appetite of a king's paranoia. These were not tests of loyalty at all, but rather reflections of fear. The crown may have been studded with jewels, but underneath it sat a man who doubted even the love laid at his feet. It is both tragic and telling that in some courts, the true measure of devotion was not affection, but obedience. When you peel away the gilded surface of history, you start to see how fragile power really is. The grandeur of the throne room, the symphonies played at banquets, the elaborate rituals of the court, all of them were carefully choreographed illusions. Behind the scenes, a single lover's hesitation could send ripples through the empire, making the mightiest man alive tremble with doubt. And perhaps that is the cruelest joke history offers. The idea that empires rose and fell not only on battlefields or in council chambers, but also in bedrooms, where loyalty was measured in ways that make us shudder today. Do not let these voices fade into silence again. Hit subscribe, stay with us, and help keep alive the lessons history carved in pain and resilience. It makes you wonder how many queens, mistresses, and lovers carried silent scars, their voices never written into the chronicles, their pain hidden behind the official histories of glory and conquest. And yet, if we look closely enough, those echoes still linger. A pause in a letter, a rumor in a chronicle, a whispered anecdote preserved by some daring scribe. They remind us that the grandeur of kings was often propped up by the suffering of those closest to them. And the stage of humiliation, once set, would only grow darker as new trials emerged, each more grotesque than the last, proving that power without trust is nothing more than theater, performed at the expense of human dignity. They called it loyalty, but it looked nothing like devotion. In many courts, the so-called proofs of love were really displays of pain disguised as affection. Kings, desperate to convince themselves of their lovers' fidelity, demanded trials of the flesh. It wasn't enough to receive whispered promises in the dark or tender gestures behind velvet curtains. No, loyalty had to be demonstrated through acts that bent the body and scarred the spirit. What began as a relationship often shifted into a twisted examination, with the lover treated not as a partner, but as a prisoner standing trial before an audience of one. And the irony was brutal. A king who already held power over life and death still craved reassurance through rituals of cruelty. Imagine, for a moment, the heavy silence of a chamber where a mistress was summoned to prove her worth. Outside the doors, soldiers guarded the kingdom, treaties were being negotiated, rebellions suppressed. Yet inside, the monarch's greatest concern was whether the woman he chose would submit to whatever strange demand proved his dominance. Sometimes it was a physical ordeal, an act so degrading it reduced the grandeur of royalty to petty theater. Other times, it was a ritual of endurance, remaining still for hours under watchful eyes, or enduring discomfort without complaint. To us, these demands sound absurd, yet within those gilded walls they became deadly serious. Refusal was not only rejection, it was defiance, and defiance against a king was dangerous. It's almost darkly comic to realize that these men, draped in gold and celebrated as chosen by God, resorted to testing loyalty with games that resembled cruel dares. What makes it more unsettling is how normalized it became. Courtiers might whisper disapproval, but most complied with the spectacle, knowing that even a raised eyebrow could be read as treason. In this way, the cruelty wasn't just personal, it was systemic. Entire courts participated, clapping and nodding while a lover's dignity was slowly stripped away. It is one of those uncomfortable truths about history. Humiliation can be a form of entertainment when survival depends on pretending to enjoy the show. But these practices were not merely about jealousy, they were about control. To demand that someone prove their loyalty through pain was to remind everyone else in the court of the king's limitless power. The message was simple. If he could do this to the person he supposedly cherished, imagine what he could do to his enemies. A mistress became a warning sign, her suffering a silent lesson to anyone who considered betrayal. And yet, despite the theatrical severity, these acts reveal not strength, but fragility. After all, true power requires no constant reassurance. The more a man insists on loyalty tests, the clearer it becomes that he doubts both himself and those around him. Curiously, history preserves small moments that expose the absurdity of it all. Chronicles tell of kings who made their lovers walk barefoot across icy stones, or fast in silence while banquets unfolded in the next hall. One monarch insisted that his mistress drink a goblet of wine spiked with bitter herbs, to prove she would endure discomfort for him. Another demanded public confessions of imaginary sins, forcing women to incriminate themselves for acts they never committed, just to demonstrate obedience. It sounds almost like satire, yet these accounts were no joke to the women involved. To them, each moment was a gamble between survival and self-annihilation. The irony grows sharper when we realize how much of this was hidden behind the facade of romance. Poets praised the king's mistresses as muses, paintings immortalized them as beauties, songs celebrated their devotion. Yet behind those artistic masks, the reality was grimmer. Their loyalty was not always earned, it was enforced. They became symbols of grace in public, but endured humiliation in private. And the most tragic part? Many of them had no voice to tell their side of the story. History remembers them only through the words of men who controlled the narrative. Their endurance is written as devotion, their silence mistaken for love. It raises an uncomfortable question that echoes across time. How often do we confuse obedience with loyalty? Even today, power structures, whether in politics, workplaces, or relationships, sometimes demand proofs that look suspiciously like submission. We may laugh at kings who forced lovers to drink bitter wine, but how different is it when someone demands sacrifice as proof of affection or constant reassurance as proof of trust? The stage may have changed, but the play feels hauntingly familiar. History, it seems, is less distant than we'd like to believe. And then there's the paradox that never goes away. The stronger the king appeared in public, the more desperate he seemed in private. His need for proof betrayed his fear. It is a contradiction that repeats itself endlessly. Those who appear most powerful are often the most insecure behind closed doors. That is why these so-called proofs of loyalty are worth examining, not just as historical curiosities, but as windows into human nature. They remind us that control is never complete, that affection cannot be manufactured by decree, and that insecurity, left unchecked, can twist love into something grotesque. The courtly stage where lovers endured such trials was both a mirror and a mask. A mirror reflecting the king's paranoia, a mask hiding the pain of those forced to play along. In that space, intimacy was weaponized, tenderness reshaped into a test. And once such rituals began, they rarely ended quietly. Each demand invited another, each proof led to a greater one, until the line between devotion and degradation was blurred beyond recognition. It is here, in this dangerous spiral, that the story grows even darker, for the king's insecurities did not stop at pain. They soon crept into the deeper realms of the mind, where manipulation became as binding as any chain. If the physical trials were painful, the psychological ones were far worse because they left no scars to point at and no evidence to present. In the gilded silence of royal chambers, manipulation was an invisible weapon, and kings wielded it with the same confidence they used to command armies. A mistress or lover was often drawn into a game where the rules shifted constantly, where words that sounded like affection were actually traps, and where the demand for loyalty became a labyrinth with no exit. To survive, one had to master not only obedience but anticipation, guessing what a king wanted before he even asked. That kind of life erodes the soul, yet history shows it was a common script for those unlucky enough to be bound to power through intimacy. One of the most common tactics was isolation. By cutting a lover off from friends, family, and confidants, the king ensured that his word became the only voice she heard. In some courts, letters were intercepted, visits forbidden, even attendants replaced with spies. Imagine the suffocation of waking each day in rooms dripping with luxury but being unable to trust a single person within them. It is a strange cruelty, to give someone everything material, but deny them the freedom of simple conversation. In modern terms, it's like being locked in a palace-shaped cage with golden bars that everyone else envies, but only you recognize as prison walls. And the cruelest part? Many courtiers and poets outside those walls believed the mistress lived in paradise. Manipulation often came disguised as affection. A king might whisper that no one else could be trusted, that the lover was his only true companion, while simultaneously planting doubts about her every gesture. One day he would shower her with jewels and praises, the next he would withdraw in icy silence, watching her squirm for approval. This push and pull created dependence, a cycle where relief only came when he chose to grant it. It's a tactic recognizable even today. Give just enough kindness to keep someone tethered, then withdraw it so they crave it all the more. The palace may be centuries away, but the psychology is timeless. There are records of kings inventing false accusations to test reaction. They would accuse their mistresses of flirting with courtiers, of betraying secrets, sometimes of conspiring with enemies. Whether the accusations were believed mattered less than watching how the lover responded. Did she cry? Did she protest? Did she stay silent? Every reaction became evidence in his eyes, feeding an endless cycle of paranoia. It's both tragic and darkly comic that the most powerful men in the world sometimes spent their evenings inventing soap operas instead of ruling kingdoms. And yet, those imaginary dramas often had real consequences: banishment, punishment, or worse. Sometimes the manipulation was subtle, woven into rituals of daily life. A lover might be forced to speak only when spoken to eat only after the king had tasted his food, or to mirror his moods without question. If he laughed, she laughed. If he frowned, she stayed silent. Over time, these rules created not just obedience, but erasure of the self. The mistress became an extension of the king's ego, a reflection of his desires, rather than a person in her own right. And yet, in small gestures, an unfinished glance, a hesitation at the edge of a sentence, traces of her own identity still lingered like candlelight fighting against shadows. What makes this stage of control so insidious is that it often appeared invisible to outsiders. Courtiers saw luxury, historians wrote of influence, poets described muses inspiring greatness. Few paused to wonder what price was paid for that influence, or whether inspiration can bloom when the soul is trapped in fear. This selective blindness tells us something uncomfortable about human nature. People are often more willing to admire the shine of power than to acknowledge the suffering that fuels it. The same blindness that allowed kings to disguise cruelty as devotion is the one that sometimes allows us, even today, to overlook manipulation when it happens behind closed doors. And then there were moments when the lover began to doubt herself. Psychological manipulation is effective precisely because it makes the victim question her own reality. Was she truly disloyal, as he suggested? Had she done something wrong without realizing it? Was her hesitation proof of guilt? Once those doubts take root, they grow like weeds, choking every thought. Historians rarely describe these women's inner lives, but anyone who has lived through manipulation knows the toll it takes. You begin to confuse control with care, punishment with passion, silence with safety. That is the cruel genius of psychological domination. It makes chains feel like bracelets. Still, fragments of resistance appear in the margins of history. There are letters where mistresses cleverly disguise their feelings, diaries that survive despite attempts to erase them, and anecdotes of subtle defiance. One story tells of a royal lover who, when accused of infidelity, calmly recited the names of all the king's own mistresses, turning the accusation back on him with a wit so sharp it silenced the room. Another tale describes a mistress who endured years of humiliation but left behind coded notes for future generations, quietly documenting the hypocrisy she endured. These moments remind us that even in the grip of manipulation, sparks of agency survived. And perhaps this is why these stories still captivate us. They are not just about kings and their lovers, they are about the human condition itself. They reveal how fragile trust can be, how easily love can be twisted into control, and how the desire for power often destroys the intimacy it craves. They remind us that manipulation thrives in silence and that laughter, even bitter laughter, can sometimes break its spell, because in the end, the psychological games were only one layer. Beneath them, darker demands awaited, and the theater of loyalty was about to take on a far more dangerous stage. Every chapter we uncover reveals not only the past, but the present we live in. Subscribe today and walk with us as we expose the patterns of power, fear, and dignity across time. When psychological manipulation no longer satisfied the fragile egos of kings, the stage shifted into darker territory, one where humiliation became spectacle and cruelty grew into ritual. What had once been whispered demands in private chambers began to spill into semi-public acts of degradation. Here, the king's obsession with proof reached grotesque extremes, and the lover's body was no longer just a symbol of affection, but a canvas on which paranoia, lust, and insecurity were painted in broad, brutal strokes. This was the moment when loyalty tests stopped resembling games of intimacy and became ordeals that scarred not only the victims, but the entire atmosphere of the court. Accounts from different dynasties tell us that kings would often demand acts so unsettling they blur the line between history and nightmare. Some required their mistresses to submit to mock trials, where courtiers acted as witnesses, the verdict always predetermined, but the humiliation painfully real. Imagine being forced to stand in the center of a hall filled with laughter, accused of sins fabricated moments earlier, then ordered to perform an act of penance that only reinforced the king's dominance. It was theater, not for entertainment, but for control, a grotesque parody of justice where the outcome was submission or ruin. And yet, courtiers applauded, for silence was a dangerous choice. There are stories, half rumor, half recorded truth, of kings forcing their lovers to serve at banquets in degrading ways. Draped in jewels yet stripped of dignity, they became unwilling ornaments, reminders that even beauty could be twisted into a warning. One tale recounts how a ruler demanded his mistress dance barefoot across a floor covered with broken rose stems and thorns, her pain masked beneath the music and applause. The symbolism was clear. Devotion was measured not in smiles or vows, but in suffering endured. And those watching were reminded that if this fate could be demanded of the beloved, what horrors awaited the disloyal? The escalation often followed a pattern. What began as subtle manipulation grew into commands that were harder to disguise. The lover was made to drink bitter concoctions, to endure sleepless nights, or to kneel for hours while the king dined and spoke of loyalty as though it were currency. Soon, the demands became physical ordeals, designed not just to test devotion, but to strip away identity. The line between intimacy and punishment vanished, and every act became a reminder that affection in the presence of power was not love at all, but survival. What makes these episodes chilling is how easily they became normalized within the palaces. Servants whispered but complied, scribes wrote carefully edited chronicles, and poets composed verses that disguised degradation as passion. We must not forget that much of what we know comes through the pens of men who had no reason to preserve the pain of women. And yet, small cracks in the record allow us glimpses of truth. An unusually sharp phrase, a contradiction in accounts, a rumor that never quite died. It is in those cracks that the humanity of the victim still speaks, faint but unbroken. The grotesque extremes of these ordeals reveal a deep irony. Kings claimed absolute power, yet their actions betrayed profound insecurity. For what is more fragile than a ruler who must demand humiliation to believe in devotion? The crown gave them armies and riches, but not peace of mind. And so they turned the people closest to them into objects of torment, mistaking control for affection. It is hard not to laugh bitterly at the image of a man who ruled thousands, yet trembled at the idea of being unloved by one. But the laughter catches in the throat, because for the women involved, there was nothing humorous about it. One cannot help but think of the psychological aftermath. A mistress who endured such ordeals might smile in public, might even appear to embrace her role, but inside carried a landscape of scars invisible to the world. These women learned to live two lives, the one on display for the court and the one hidden within themselves, filled with fear, shame, and perhaps a quiet ember of defiance. And sometimes, in rare moments of courage, that ember flared into acts of resistance. A whispered refusal, a subtle act of disobedience, a carefully planted rumor that shifted power in unexpected ways. The darker the ordeal, the more precious those sparks of rebellion became. History, in its relentless irony, often rewarded cruelty with consequences. Some kings who forced such trials on their lovers became the subjects of scandal that weakened their reigns. Others found themselves betrayed in turn, the very paranoia they tried to control creating the disloyalty they feared. After all, one cannot demand loyalty through humiliation without eventually destroying the bond itself. Trust, once broken, is rarely mended by force, and when a king learned that truth too late, it was not only his mistress who paid the price, but his kingdom as well. As these extremes unfolded, the stage of humiliation widened. No longer confined to private chambers or whispered rumors, it began to seep into the very fabric of the court's culture. Loyalty was no longer tested with vows or alliances, but with orchestrated suffering. And once humiliation became ritual, it was only a matter of time before it transformed into spectacle, a spectacle that not only exposed the darkest corners of royal desire, but also set the stage for betrayal, rebellion, and the eventual unraveling of power itself. There comes a moment in every story of domination when silence begins to crack, when the performance of obedience becomes too heavy to carry, and when whispers turn into the first signs of rebellion. In the courts of kings, where humiliation had become ritual and submission, the currency of intimacy, this turning point often arrived quietly, almost invisibly, before swelling into something unstoppable. For the mistresses who endured years of trials and degradations, the breaking of silence was not a sudden act of courage, but the slow accumulation of small fractures, moments of doubt, glimpses of solidarity, or even accidents that revealed the truth to others. And it is in these fragile beginnings that we see the first sparks of liberation. Sometimes the catalyst came from an unexpected source. A maid who lingered too long at the chamber door might catch a muffled cry. A court musician, tasked with playing to cover the sounds of a ritual humiliation, might notice the tremor in a mistress's hands. Even scribes, sworn to shape history into flattery, occasionally slipped a telling phrase into their chronicles. Power thrives in secrecy, but secrecy is fragile in a palace where hundreds of eyes and ears wait in every hallway. Slowly, the king's private games began to leak into public rumor, and once rumors spread, they could not be controlled, no matter how many decrees were issued. One story tells of a young attendant who saw bruises hidden beneath silks and dared to whisper her concerns to a visiting noblewoman. That noblewoman, outraged, carried the story beyond the palace walls, where it stirred gossip among rivals eager to exploit the king's flaws. What had once been confined to locked chambers became the subject of subtle jokes and sharp criticisms. And here lies a bitter irony. The same courtiers who once applauded the humiliations now repeated them as scandalous tales, eager to distance themselves from cruelty when it no longer seemed safe to endorse it. It shows how quickly loyalty evaporates when the winds of power begin to shift. For the mistresses themselves, the breaking point often came when the humiliation no longer threatened only their dignity, but their survival. To live under constant suspicion, to endure ordeals that stripped away both body and spirit, eventually became unbearable. And history records moments when these women, long silent, suddenly spoke. Sometimes it was a direct confrontation, a refusal in the king's presence that stunned everyone into silence. Other times it was a quiet confession to a priest, a coded message slipped into a letter, or an outburst during a banquet when wine loosened the tongue. Each act, however small, was a fracture in the carefully constructed illusion of devotion. What makes these stories compelling is not just the courage of resistance, but the unpredictable ways in which they unfolded. Some mistresses found unlikely allies in queens themselves, women who, though rivals, shared the experience of being trapped in roles defined by a man's paranoia. Others found protection from foreign diplomats who recognized an opportunity to weaken a king by exposing his abuses. In rare cases, even the common people, peasants who usually had no voice in palace matters, caught wind of the cruelty and turned it into songs and ballads. Imagine the sting for a king, hearing his insecurities mocked in the marketplace while still commanding armies. That is the power of voices once silenced. They spread faster than decrees and endured longer than punishments. And yet, breaking silence was never without risk. For every mistress who found a way to resist, there were many whose attempts ended in banishment, imprisonment, or worse. Kings who demanded loyalty through humiliation were rarely merciful when faced with defiance. Still, even failed acts of resistance carried weight, for they planted seeds of doubt in the minds of those who watched. A single refusal, though punished, could inspire others to question, to whisper, to conspire. And once doubt entered the bloodstream of a court, it was impossible to purge completely. One cannot ignore the role of timing in these turning points. Often, resistance gained traction when the king's power was already weakened by military failures, financial strain, or political rivalries. A mistress's voice, once dismissed, suddenly found eager ears among those who wished to topple the throne. This intersection of personal suffering and political opportunity created moments of profound change. What began as a private cry for dignity sometimes became the spark that ignited wider unrest. It is a reminder that personal stories, no matter how hidden, can shape the fate of entire nations when they collide with the tides of history. The liberation, however, was rarely clean or immediate. For some women, breaking silence meant escape into exile, where they lived in obscurity but finally breathed free. For others, it meant transforming humiliation into testimony, ensuring their suffering was remembered not as devotion but as evidence of cruelty. And in the most dramatic cases, it meant the king himself was confronted, not just by his lover but by his court, his people, or even his enemies. These were the moments when the theater of loyalty collapsed, when the mask of absolute power slipped to reveal the insecurity beneath. What fascinates us even now is how these turning points echo across centuries. We see in them the universal truth that power built on fear eventually devours itself. Humiliation can enforce silence for a time, but silence is never permanent. People, whether in royal courts or ordinary homes, reach a moment when the cost of obedience outweighs the fear of rebellion. And once that threshold is crossed, the story changes forever. In the end, the breaking of silence did more than liberate individuals. It revealed the hollowness of the system itself. Kings who demanded proofs of loyalty found that their obsession only produced betrayal, scandal, and instability. Their courts, once gilded with illusion, became fragile houses of cards, and as the whispers grew into voices and the voices into defiance, the stage was set for something greater than rebellion. It was the dawn of transformation, the moment when private suffering became public reckoning, and when even the mightiest crowns trembled before the truth. The moment silence shattered, consequences rippled outward with a force no king could fully contain. What began as whispers behind embroidered curtains soon echoed in corridors, then seeped beyond palace walls, reshaping reputations and even the fate of kingdoms. The cruel irony is that the very practices kings designed to secure loyalty often produce the opposite effect: betrayal, scandal, and instability. When humiliation and fear ceased to be enough, when mistresses, attendants, and even rivals dared to speak, the carefully constructed facade of absolute control crumbled. And in that collapse, history revealed both the fragility of power and the resilience of those who had endured it. Some monarchs reacted with violent fury, doubling down on punishment as though fear could patch the cracks, banishing mistresses to convents, silencing attendants through threats, or ordering executions under the guise of treason became desperate attempts to reclaim dominance. But repression rarely worked for long. The more force a king used, the more obvious his weakness became. A ruler who must crush voices within his own household is already at war with himself. Courtiers noticed, foreign ambassadors whispered, and soon enemies abroad saw opportunity in the king's inability to master his private sphere. Personal cruelty became political liability. Others tried to mask their guilt with gifts and proclamations. History gives us tales of kings who suddenly turned generous, commissioning portraits of their mistresses, showering them with estates, or praising them in public after years of private torment. But such gestures rarely erased the memory of what had come before. People are not fooled for long. A gilded cage is still a cage, even when decorated with jewels. And for mistresses who had found a taste of freedom in speaking out, no amount of wealth could undo the scars of humiliation. In fact, the gifts often became symbols of hypocrisy, reminders that affection could not be bought any more than loyalty could be forced. There are fascinating examples where the exposure of cruelty reshaped entire courts. In France, in Spain, in smaller German principalities, rumors of mistreatment fueled satirical pamphlets and biting plays that circulated beyond palace gates. Ordinary people, who had no direct access to royalty, suddenly felt emboldened to mock their rulers. Kings who believed themselves untouchable discovered their reputations shredded in taverns and markets. Imagine the sting for a man whose portrait hung in cathedrals, only to hear his name turned into a crude joke by peasants drunk on cheap wine. This was more than embarrassment. It was a loss of the sacred aura of kingship itself. And for the women who endured, the consequences were complex. Some vanished into obscurity, retreating to convents or estates far from court, where they rebuilt their lives in anonymity. Others transformed their pain into power, leveraging sympathy or alliances to gain influence in unexpected ways. A few became cautionary symbols, their names invoked in hushed tones to warn future mistresses of the dangers of royal favor. And yet, there were also those who found a kind of vindication. Their testimony, whether whispered to priests, written in secret diaries, or carried by sympathetic courtiers, survived the centuries. Against all odds, their voices, once smothered, still echo. The consequences also reached queens, who often played silent roles in these dramas. For some, the humiliation of seeing mistresses degraded brought no satisfaction, only fear that they themselves might be next in line for cruelty. In other cases, queens seized the scandal as leverage, strengthening their own influence by positioning themselves as dignified counterpoints to their husbands' excesses. It is remarkable how many queens, long dismissed as passive figures, quietly shaped outcomes during these moments of unraveling. Where kings faltered in paranoia, queens often maneuvered with patience, ensuring the dynasty survived even if the monarch's reputation did not. One of the most striking consequences was how these private scandals intertwined with larger political events. A king weakened by exposure at home became vulnerable abroad. Alliances faltered, treaties collapsed, rivals grew bolder. It is no exaggeration to say that empires were shaped not only by battles and diplomacy, but also by the private cruelties of rulers whose insecurities spilled into public life. In this way, the suffering of a single mistress could tilt the balance of power between nations. History rarely credits them, but these women, through their endurance and eventual defiance, altered the trajectories of entire kingdoms. And perhaps the most enduring consequence was the lesson these stories left for future generations. They revealed the emptiness of control built on humiliation, the futility of demanding love through fear. Kings believed they were writing scripts of dominance, but what survived were narratives of fragility. The chronicles preserved not their victories, but their insecurities, not their strength, but their desperation. In the end, the mistresses they sought to silence often became the truest reflections of their reigns, living mirrors of the corruption and paranoia that defined their courts. As we read these tales centuries later, we cannot help but feel the paradox of history. The grandeur of kings is long gone, their crowns tarnished and their palaces turned into museums, yet the stories of their lovers, once hidden in whispers, still resonate. They remind us that power without trust corrodes from within, that cruelty always leaves cracks for truth to seep through, and that even the smallest voice, when raised at the right moment, can shake the foundations of a throne. But history never closes its book neatly. Each ending is also a beginning, and the echoes of these scandals often seeded the ground for even greater transformations. The exposure of cruelty did not merely topple reputations. It began to change how societies viewed loyalty, intimacy, and the responsibilities of power itself. And as the courts reeled from scandal, a new question began to rise. If kings could not master their own households, how long could they pretend to master entire kingdoms? The scandal of kings demanding humiliating proofs of loyalty did not remain confined to palace chambers or whispered chronicles. Over time, it began to seep into the cultural fabric, reshaping how people understood not only monarchy, but intimacy, authority, and the strange bargains power demands. What once passed as unquestioned ritual slowly became a subject of critique, satire, and eventually reform. And in that transformation, society itself was altered, often in ways the kings never intended. For all their efforts to project strength, their cruelty exposed the vulnerability of absolute rule, sparking conversations that stretched far beyond the court. One of the first shifts was in literature and performance. Poets and playwrights, often too cautious to mention rulers by name, began weaving allegories that mirrored the humiliations of mistresses in their stories. A tragedy about a tyrant demanding impossible proofs of loyalty was not simply entertainment, it was coded commentary. Audiences understood the references, and the laughter or tears stirred in theaters became a subtle form of resistance. In Spain's Golden Age, in France's salons, and in England's emerging stage culture, art became the medium through which private scandals were aired publicly without directly challenging the throne. In this way, cruelty behind closed doors planted seeds of satire that blossomed into cultural critique. Music, too, carried whispers. Ballads, sung in marketplaces, often contained veiled references to kings who mistreated their lovers, disguised as tales of knights and maidens. The melodies seemed harmless, but the words lingered like smoke, passing scandal into the mouths of ordinary people who might never set foot in a palace. It's telling that power feared laughter more than armies. A kingdom could endure invasion and still survive. But once its ruler became a subject of mockery, the sacred aura of monarchy began to erode. It is perhaps no coincidence that in times of greatest cruelty, satire thrived most. These shifts also altered perceptions of love and marriage. The more people learned, through rumor, art, or scandal, that kings treated intimacy as theater, the more ordinary couples contrasted their own lives against the palace's grotesque dramas. Ironically, the cruelty of kings sometimes elevated the value of ordinary affection. In villages and towns, people began to speak more about trust as the foundation of relationships, mocking the idea that love could ever be proven through humiliation. In this way, royal excesses pushed common culture toward a more human understanding of devotion. What kings corrupted, people reclaimed. Yet the influence was not purely sentimental. These scandals carried political consequences that reshaped governance itself. As absolute monarchs lost credibility, advisors, parliaments, and councils gained power. When rulers were mocked for their insecurities, arguments for shared governance suddenly sounded less radical. The image of the all-powerful king, untouchable and wise, crumbled beneath the weight of exposed paranoia. And in that crumbling, space opened for new ideas. Ideas about checks on power, about accountability, and about the separation between personal indulgence and political responsibility. The humiliation of mistresses may seem like a private matter, but in truth, it chipped away at the ideological foundation of monarchy. Curiously, religion also shifted in response. Priests and preachers, long aligned with kings, began to use sermons to criticize the immorality of rulers who mistreated those closest to them. Though careful not to name names, they spoke of divine judgment against those who twisted intimacy into cruelty. Congregations, already murmuring with rumors, connected the dots easily enough. The pulpit, once a platform for reinforcing royal power, became a quiet stage for questioning it. And when faith itself began to turn against the throne, the erosion of authority deepened further. In some cases, the mistresses themselves became cultural symbols. Their endurance, their whispered acts of defiance, even their tragic ends transformed them into legends, retold in salons and taverns alike. They became martyrs of intimacy, figures through which people contemplated the dangers of unchecked power. One can imagine a woman in a distant village, hearing of a royal mistress's suffering, feeling both pity and recognition. These stories, though born of oppression, created bonds of empathy across class lines. And empathy, once ignited, is one of the most powerful forces for change. The spread of these narratives also reveals something profoundly human. People crave stories of downfall as much as they admire stories of glory. A king triumphant on the battlefield inspires awe, but a king revealed as petty and paranoid inspires fascination of a different kind. It is almost comedic, in a bitter way, to realize that some monarchs who sought immortality through conquest are remembered today more vividly for their jealous humiliations than for their military victories. Power may build monuments, but scandal builds memory. What makes this cultural transformation so compelling is its gradualness. No one moment shattered the idea of monarchy. Instead, it was the slow drip of rumor, art, satire, and whispered testimony that eroded the facade. Each song, each play, each scandalous anecdote chipped away at the marble statue of royal authority until cracks appeared too wide to ignore. And once a society begins to laugh at its rulers, the path toward revolution, whether cultural or political, becomes inevitable. And yet, even as these changes unfolded, the story was not over. Kings continued to cling to their rituals, mistresses continued to suffer and resist, and society continued to wrestle with the contradictions of power and intimacy. The cultural shift was only the beginning. Beyond it lay the true test. What happens when private cruelty collides with public accountability, when the exposure of humiliation leads not just to satire, but to open revolt? That is where the story deepens. Moving from whispered rumor to collective defiance, from personal scandal to the great upheavals that reshaped entire nations, revolutions rarely begin with trumpets. More often, they begin with whispers. The humiliations inflicted by kings upon their lovers may seem like private sins, hidden within perfumed chambers. But history has a way of turning personal cruelty into public scandal. What begins as rumor grows into satire. Satire becomes outrage, and outrage, when mixed with hunger, injustice, and resentment, explodes into rebellion. By the time mistresses and queens began to speak, or their suffering was revealed through gossip and art, the damage to royal authority had already taken root. The aura of kingship, once bathed in divine light, flickered under the shadow of their insecurities, and people started to ask questions that were once unthinkable. Take France, for instance, a kingdom that prided itself on grandeur and spectacle. Tales of mistresses humiliated at court spread through salons and pamphlets, mingling with grievances about taxation and privilege. Suddenly, the cruelty that seemed confined to gilded walls was seen as a reflection of a broader sickness in the monarchy. If a king could not honor the dignity of those closest to him, how could he be trusted to honor the dignity of his people? That simple but dangerous question became the seed of doubt that would later erupt into revolution. The mistreated mistress, once silenced, became an unintentional symbol of a nation's disillusionment. England, too, provides striking examples. The turbulence of Henry VIII's reign, where wives were discarded, humiliated, and executed, was not just marital drama, but political theater with deadly consequences. The king's paranoia and obsession with control shattered not only his household, but the very relationship between church and crown. A personal desire for loyalty, twisted into public cruelty, helped birth the English Reformation. One man's insecurities rewrote the spiritual destiny of an entire nation. It is a reminder that revolutions need not always be fought with muskets. Sometimes they begin in bedrooms where power reveals its most fragile face, and in smaller courts across Europe, where principalities and duchies balanced on delicate alliances, scandals of humiliation spread like wildfire. A single whispered story about a duke forcing his mistress to endure a degrading trial could destabilize fragile treaties. Rivals seized these stories, amplifying them to weaken enemies. What began as an act of control within four walls became fuel for wars, rebellions, and diplomatic collapses. History is filled with kings who imagined themselves unassailable but were undone not by mighty armies, but by their own appetites turned against them. What is fascinating is how the people themselves absorbed these scandals. Pamphleteers in 17th and 18th century Europe often exaggerated tales of royal cruelty, knowing that a humiliated mistress captured the imagination more than dry political theory. Ordinary men and women who might not understand the nuances of taxation or foreign policy understood perfectly the cruelty of a jealous king. The story of a woman forced to drink bitter wine, or paraded as proof of loyalty, stirred anger and pity alike. In taverns, such tales became metaphors. The people saw themselves in the role of the mistress, humiliated by rulers who demanded submission without offering respect. That leap of empathy turned personal scandal into collective outrage. Curiously, many rulers underestimated the power of perception. They believed their cruelty would remain hidden, or that even if exposed, their people would dismiss it as trivial. But perception is everything in politics. Once the king was seen not as majestic, but as ridiculous or cruel, the spell of divine right broke. This was no small shift. For centuries, monarchy survived on theater. The illusion that kings were chosen by God beyond ordinary human failings. The revelation that a king could be as petty, jealous, and insecure as any husband in a village tavern stripped away that sacred aura. And when the aura vanished, only a man remained, vulnerable to the judgment of the crowd. The revolts that followed were not always immediate, but the link between private cruelty and public rebellion is undeniable. In France, the humiliation of women at court fed into broader outrage about corruption and excess, helping light the fires of 1789. In England, Henry VIII's treatment of wives reshaped church and crown forever. Even in smaller states, scandals of mistresses became weapons for rebels and rivals. And beyond Europe, similar stories played out in empires from the Ottoman court to the Russian czars, where the mistreatment of women often mirrored deeper cracks in the foundation of power. The most striking irony is this: kings demanded humiliating proofs of loyalty to secure their power, but in doing so, they often planted the seeds of their own downfall. The very acts meant to demonstrate control revealed weakness. A king who forced devotion through cruelty proved not his strength, but his insecurity, and insecurity is contagious. It spreads from chambers to courtiers, from courtiers to rivals, and from rivals to the people, until the entire system trembles. And yet, revolutions are not only about collapse, they are also about transformation. The exposure of royal humiliations forced societies to rethink what leadership should look like. If kings could not be trusted with the dignity of their own households, perhaps they could not be trusted with nations. This realization fueled demands for accountability, for checks on power, for systems where no single man's paranoia could dictate the lives of millions. The revolts born from private scandals helped birth the modern idea of governance, where rulers are no longer gods but servants of their people. Still, the story does not end there, for even as revolutions erupted, new rulers rose, and the same pattern sometimes repeated. Power, after all, has a way of disguising itself in new costumes, even when old ones are discarded. Which raises the question, if humiliation and insecurity once toppled kings, how often do they still shape the leaders of today, only hidden behind more modern veils? And in that question lies the bridge to the next chapter, where the echoes of the past remind us that the theater of loyalty is never entirely gone, only reinvented for each age. By the time revolutions had shaken thrones across Europe, the theater of loyalty trials seemed like something that belonged to a darker, bygone age. Yet history has a stubborn way of echoing itself, dressing old patterns in new clothes. The humiliation of mistresses may have faded from the grand palaces of Versailles or Madrid, but the psychology that fueled it, the insecurity of rulers, the obsession with appearances, the desperate need to control affection, did not vanish. Instead, it adapted. And as monarchies modernized, as empires gave way to constitutional crowns or even republics, the shadow of those old humiliations lingered, shaping the way rulers behaved and the way people watched them. Consider the 19th century, when monarchies were forced to become more public than ever before. Photography, newspapers, and mass literacy meant that royal households were no longer hidden sanctuaries but spectacles, scrutinized by the press. Scandals that might once have been whispered in salons were now printed in headlines. And with that shift came a transformation. Where kings once staged humiliations in private chambers, now the humiliation arrived from outside, in the form of gossip columns and satirical cartoons. If the 16th century king demanded proofs of loyalty from his mistress, the 19th century king feared proofs of disloyalty printed in scandal sheets. The stage had changed, but the insecurity remained. Take the case of Britain's George IV, a man whose private life was a circus of excess, infidelity, and paranoia. His treatment of Queen Caroline became a national scandal, with public trials and accusations of adultery that spilled far beyond palace gates. Crowds gathered in the streets not to honor their king, but to mock him, cheering his estranged wife instead. It was a reversal almost comical in its cruelty. The ruler who once demanded submission from his spouse found himself humiliated before his entire nation. In a sense, the public had turned the tools of degradation back on the throne, proving that in the age of mass opinion, no monarch could escape the judgment of the crowd. The Habsburgs of Austria faced similar trials. Their empire was collapsing under the weight of nationalism, and yet gossip about Empress Elizabeth, her beauty, her diets, her rumored affairs, captured as much attention as politics. For a woman who lived under constant scrutiny, devotion became less about pleasing her husband and more about surviving the gaze of millions. The humiliation was subtler, but it was still present. A life performed under endless observation, where a misstep in etiquette or fashion could spark rumors that shook the empire's image. What once took place in secret chambers now unfolded on the public stage of modern Europe. The 20th century intensified this pattern. With the rise of radio, television, and later tabloids, the private lives of monarchs became inseparable from their political legitimacy. Consider Edward V of Britain, whose love for Wallis Simpson was deemed a scandal so great it forced his abdication. In another age, a king might have demanded humiliating proofs of loyalty from his mistress. In this age, the humiliation came from a global audience questioning whether love could ever be placed above duty. It is a striking reversal. No longer was it the mistress forced to prove devotion, but the monarch himself who had to prove his to the crown. And when he failed, he lost it. And yet, even outside monarchies, the echoes persisted. Modern politics is filled with leaders whose insecurities manifest in strange rituals of loyalty. Dictators demand staged applause, choreographed parades, and public declarations of devotion that serve the same purpose as the old humiliations, to reassure fragile egos that power is unshakable. Whether in a gilded throne room or a stadium filled with orchestrated cheers, the psychology remains familiar. What kings once demanded of mistresses, modern rulers often demand of entire nations. The stage is larger, the audience global, but the underlying insecurity is the same. It raises an uncomfortable question. Have we truly left behind the culture of enforced loyalty, or have we merely expanded its reach? Social media now amplifies both adoration and ridicule. A leader's image is built and broken in real time, with millions of voices acting as courtiers. A rumor, a leaked photo, a whispered scandal can undo reputations faster than any pamphlet or ballad of the past. Kings once trembled at the laughter of their mistresses. Today's rulers tremble at hashtags. The tools have changed, but the fragility of power remains constant. There is a dark comedy in realizing that the very technologies designed to immortalize authority, paintings, photography, television, Twitter, also democratized humiliation. What was once whispered by a scribe is now shouted by millions online. Power can project strength through polished images, but the smallest crack becomes viral. In this sense, rulers are more vulnerable than ever, trapped in a paradox of visibility. To be adored, they must be seen, but to be seen is also to risk exposure. The court of public opinion has become the harshest stage of all, and still, the question of intimacy and power lingers. Modern scandals, royal divorces, affairs, leaked conversations continue to fascinate because they echo the same dynamic. The blending of private vulnerability with public authority. People still crave stories of rulers undone not by war but by love, not by conquest but by insecurity. It is as if humanity delights in watching the mighty stumble over the same weaknesses that plague everyone else. The theater of loyalty remains, though its costumes have changed. Which leads us to a final reflection. If history shows us that power is always shadowed by insecurity, then perhaps the real question is not whether rulers will demand proofs of loyalty, but what form those proofs will take in the future. Will it be staged applause, viral propaganda, carefully curated Instagram posts? The theater continues, only with brighter lights and bigger audiences. And behind it all, the same fragile human truth persists. That no crown, no matter how heavy, can quiet the gnawing doubt that those closest to you, or those who cheer you the loudest, may not truly be loyal at all. Every story, no matter how dark, seeks resolution, and the tale of kings demanding humiliating proofs of loyalty is no different. What began in hidden chambers as whispers of insecurity eventually spilled into culture, into politics, and finally into the modern world, reshaping not only the idea of monarchy, but the very concept of power itself. And yet, the deeper we trace the arc of this history, the clearer it becomes that the central theme has never really changed. Whether in a medieval palace, a revolutionary square, or a modern digital feed, the struggle remains the same. Those in power crave loyalty, and those without power resist humiliation. The stage changes, the costumes evolve, but the human drama continues. Looking back, we see how kings once draped themselves in velvet and demanded submission from the women closest to them, turning intimacy into theater. These acts of control were not merely private excesses, but reflections of a broader truth. Power is never secure on its own. It requires performance, validation, and endless reassurance. A crown may weigh heavily on the head, but it weighs even more heavily on the heart of a man who doubts whether his authority is truly respected. And so, in their desperation, rulers sought proof through rituals of humiliation. It was a tragic irony that the very acts designed to affirm power instead exposed its fragility. The consequences, of course, were profound. Scandals leaked beyond palace walls, transforming into satire, songs, and finally revolts. The mistresses, who suffered in silence, became unwitting symbols of a larger injustice. Their humiliation mirrored the people. Their forced obedience reflected the nation's subjugation. In this sense, their private suffering became political fuel, sparking revolutions that toppled dynasties. We often imagine revolts as born of taxes and famine, but history reminds us that they also feed on stories, the kind that humanize tyranny and make cruelty visible. And nothing makes power seem more absurd than a king undone by his own insecurities and love. By the 19th and 20th centuries, the theater of humiliation had shifted into the public sphere. Where once kings tested their mistresses, now they themselves were tested by the glare of public opinion. Newspapers printed every rumor, caricatures mocked their weaknesses, and later television and tabloids amplified every scandal. Rulers who once demanded loyalty at sword's edge now begged for approval in headlines. The humiliation persisted, but the roles had changed. It was no longer confined to the powerless. It became the price of being powerful in an age of mass visibility. A curious reversal. The king who once demanded proofs of devotion now found himself performing for the devotion of his people. And today, in the digital age, the theater has grown larger still. Leaders no longer fear whispers in salons, but hashtags trending across continents. A scandal can erupt overnight, a rumor magnified by millions of screens. The craving for loyalty is still there, but so too is the terror of humiliation. Only now it plays out on a global stage with no curtains to hide behind. Power, once cloaked in mystery, is now naked before the eyes of billions. And just like the mistresses of old, modern rulers live under constant surveillance, measured not only by their actions, but by the interpretations and emotions of others. What fascinates us is not just the continuity of these patterns, but the way they reveal something essential about the human condition. At its core, the demand for humiliating proofs of loyalty was never truly about love or even about power. It was about fear. Fear of betrayal, fear of ridicule, fear of being forgotten. Kings cloaked that fear in rituals, but the emotion itself is universal. Who among us has not, in some small way, sought reassurance in clumsy or destructive forms? The difference is that for rulers, those fears were magnified by crowns and armies, their personal insecurities written across the fate of nations. Perhaps that is why these stories endure, why they captivate us even centuries later. They remind us that beneath the jewels and titles, kings were fragile men, undone by the same doubts and anxieties that haunt us all. Their cruelty was not born of strength but of weakness, not of confidence but of insecurity. And the mistresses who endured, resisted, or exposed them remind us of another truth, that even in the darkest corners of power, voices of defiance can survive. Sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, those voices carry across time, reminding us that humiliation is never the final word. So what, then, is the legacy of these humiliations? On one level, they toppled monarchs and reshaped societies, contributing to revolutions and reforms that paved the way for modern governance. On another, they altered culture itself, shifting how people understood intimacy, love, and power. And on the deepest level, they exposed the paradox at the heart of authority, that those who appear most powerful are often the most insecure. This paradox has not vanished. It continues to shape our leaders, our politics, and even our personal relationships. We are still living inside the theater of loyalty, only now the lights are brighter and the audience far larger. And so the story ends where it began, not with crowns and chambers, but with the fragile human heart. The kings who demanded loyalty through humiliation lost more than their mistress's affection. They lost the very thing they sought to protect, trust. For without trust, power corrodes from within, and without dignity, love cannot survive. This is the lesson their stories leave us, that control is an illusion, loyalty cannot be forced, and humiliation, no matter how carefully staged, always leaves cracks for truth to break through. Yet even as we close this chapter, the question lingers. If history is a mirror, then what does it reflect about us? In our own time, with our own rituals of loyalty, whether in politics, workplaces, or relationships, how often do we repeat the mistakes of kings, disguising fear as power and control as love? That lingering question is why these stories matter still, not as relics of the past, but as warnings for the present, because the theater of loyalty has not ended. It only waits for its next stage, its next audience, and its next unraveling. There is always a shadow that lingers after the curtain falls, and in the long arc of history, that shadow often proves more revealing than the spectacle itself. The humiliations kings demanded of their lovers may have passed into the chronicles of centuries past, but their echoes stretch far into the present, shaping not only how we remember rulers, but how we understand the very nature of power. Part 11 of this story is less about palaces and crowns than about the traces those cruelties left behind, traces etched into culture, memory, and the human psyche. These legacies are not confined to marble statues or dusty scrolls. They live on in the way we tell stories, the way we question authority, and the way we laugh uneasily at the fragility of those who claim strength. One of the most striking aftershocks lies in the realm of literature and myth-making. Many of the tales of tyrannical kings and their mistreated queens or mistresses became woven into folklore, retold across generations with shifting details but the same moral heart. That power without compassion corrodes, and love forced by fear is no love at all. Think of Shakespeare, who drew on both history and rumor to craft his tyrants. Kings who demanded proof, who fell into paranoia, who lost their thrones because they could not master their own insecurities. He did not invent these archetypes, he distilled them. And once distilled, they became timeless. Even now, we find traces of these patterns in modern novels, films, and series where the insecure ruler, undone by jealousy and cruelty, still fascinates audiences. But beyond art, there is a subtler legacy, the way societies recalibrated their relationship with authority. When the private scandals of monarchs became public knowledge, they cracked the illusion that rulers were somehow above human failings. The divine right of kings was not destroyed solely by philosophy or revolution. It was also corroded by gossip, by laughter, by the recognition that a man who humiliates his mistress out of fear is no god but simply a man, and a pitiful one at that. This realization shifted expectations. People began to demand not just strength from leaders, but dignity, integrity, and restraint. And though history has often fallen short of that demand, the expectation itself reshaped politics. There is also a fascinating psychological legacy. The rituals of humiliation revealed something that many prefer to ignore, that power and insecurity are not opposites, but companions. A crown does not erase doubt, it amplifies it. The greater the authority, the greater the fear of betrayal. This truth, once whispered about monarchs, has seeped into our understanding of leadership in general. Even today, when a politician overreacts to criticism, or when a CEO demands theatrical displays of loyalty, we recognize the echo. We may not always call it by name, but deep down we sense the same fragile psychology that once drove kings to their extremes. In that recognition lies both caution and comedy. Curiously, many modern institutions still carry symbolic traces of those older rituals. Consider the elaborate ceremonies of royal families that survive today. Balcony appearances, parades, handshakes carefully choreographed for cameras. These are no longer tests of mistresses, but they serve a similar purpose: to demonstrate devotion, to prove loyalty, to reassure both ruler and ruled that the bond still holds. We no longer call them humiliations, yet the structure is familiar. Staged performances designed to calm insecurity. And the public, knowingly or not, plays along, clapping at the right moment, nodding at the right lines, as courtiers once did in gilded halls. There is another legacy, darker and more personal: the silence of those whose voices were erased. For every mistress who found a way to resist, dozens disappeared into obscurity, their pain unrecorded. Their stories did not vanish completely, though. They live in the silences of history, in the sudden gaps of chronicles, in the contradictions of accounts. When we study those silences, we confront an uncomfortable truth: that much of what we know about power is filtered through the pens of those who served it. The absence of women's voices is itself a kind of proof of the humiliations they endured. And in the modern era, as we work to recover those voices, we're not simply telling their stories, but reshaping our understanding of history itself. The comic irony, of course, is how often these legacies show up in unexpected places. We see it when leaders obsess over approval ratings as if they were love letters, when celebrities stage over-the-top declarations of loyalty from fans, when companies demand public proof of commitment from employees. Each of these, in its own way, echoes the same theater: the fragile heart beneath the heavy crown forever craving reassurance. The difference is that we now recognize it more easily, and often we mock it. Memes and satire today perform the same role as ballads and pamphlets centuries ago. They puncture the illusion of invincibility, reminding us that power is always a costume, never the person beneath it. And so we arrive at the most important legacy: vigilance. The memory of those humiliations teaches us to be wary whenever power begins to demand too much, whenever loyalty is measured not by trust but by performance. History's cautionary tales are not meant to be locked away in museums. They are warnings etched into the collective mind. They remind us that humiliation, once normalized, spreads like smoke, suffocating both the victims and the rulers who ignite it, and the cost is always greater than the momentary reassurance it provides. Yet even as we absorb these lessons, the story refuses to settle into tidy closure, for the same dynamics continue to reappear, reshaped by technology and culture. The insecure king of the past is mirrored in the insecure leader of today, just as the humiliated mistress is mirrored in those still silenced by fear. The theater of loyalty has not ended. It simply waits for its next performance. And that anticipation, half dread, half fascination, draws us forward still toward the next chapter of power's endless play. The story of humiliations demanded by kings may seem like a relic of distant courts, wrapped in velvet and whispered through candlelit chambers. But its echoes are closer than we think, not just in politics or institutions, but in the small, fragile spaces of everyday relationships. The desire for control, the fear of betrayal, the insistence on proof, these are not confined to monarchs with crowns and armies. They live inside ordinary households, in marriages, in friendships, even in workplaces. What history reveals at the grandest scale often plays out in miniature in our daily lives. Part 12 brings the tale inward, into the intimate world where power and insecurity continue their uneasy dance. One of the clearest parallels is the demand for constant reassurance. Just as kings once demanded humiliating proofs of loyalty, modern partners sometimes ask for endless demonstrations of devotion. Text messages every hour, access to private accounts, exaggerated declarations of love. On the surface, these gestures may seem harmless, even romantic, but beneath them lies the same dynamic that fueled royal insecurities, the inability to trust without spectacle. Love is no longer a quiet bond, but a performance, measured not by sincerity, but by frequency and intensity. And as with kings, these demands often erode the very trust they were meant to secure. Consider the subtle rituals of jealousy that shape so many relationships. A husband who interrogates his wife after she speaks too warmly with a neighbor. A wife who checks her partner's phone for signs of infidelity. These are not unlike the whispered accusations kings hurled at mistresses, watching every reaction as though it were evidence in a trial. The setting may be smaller, a kitchen instead of a throne room, but the psychology is the same, and the outcome is similar too. Love slowly transformed into suspicion, intimacy reshaped into surveillance. It is almost comical how history repeats itself. Only now the palace guards are replaced by phone passwords and social media stalking. There is also the question of obedience disguised as loyalty. How many times have people heard phrases like, "If you loved me, you would do this for me"? It is the modern equivalent of drinking the bitter wine, of dancing barefoot on thorns. The specific acts may differ, but the underlying mechanism is unchanged. Devotion measured by sacrifice, love tested by compliance. And just as in the courts of kings, these tests rarely end with one demand. Once obedience becomes the currency of affection, the demands multiply. What begins as a request becomes a pattern, and what begins as reassurance becomes control. Psychologists today call this dynamic toxic dependency or coercive control, but its roots stretch back centuries. It thrives on the same insecurities that plagued monarchs: the fear of abandonment, the suspicion that love is conditional, the hunger for certainty in a world where certainty is impossible. And the lesson remains the same. The more one demands proof, the less authentic the proof becomes. A partner who is forced to declare love every day may comply, but compliance is not the same as affection. In the end, the tests destroy the very intimacy they were meant to protect. Curiously, just as courtiers once applauded humiliations to protect themselves, modern bystanders often enable unhealthy dynamics without realizing it. Friends may laugh off controlling behavior as passion, families may dismiss jealousy as proof of love, and societies may romanticize sacrifice as the ultimate expression of devotion. We still write songs, make movies, and tell stories that glorify obsession, confusing it with loyalty. And so the same theater continues, just with different scripts and costumes playing out in countless homes across the world. Yet, as history showed us, resistance always finds its voice. In relationships, too, there comes a point when silence cracks. People begin to recognize patterns, to name manipulation for what it is, to see the difference between love freely given and love demanded through fear. Therapists, writers, and activists today echo the defiance of mistresses who once whispered their truths in secret letters. They remind us that intimacy must be built on trust, not on trials, and that devotion loses its meaning when coerced. Their voices are the modern equivalent of the ballads and pamphlets that once mocked insecure kings, subtle, persistent, and transformative. What makes this reflection so powerful is that it blurs the line between past and present. The insecure monarch is not just a figure in a dusty chronicle. He lives inside anyone who confuses love with control. The silenced mistress is not just a tragic figure from history. She lives inside anyone who swallows their truth to keep the peace. And the courtiers who once applauded cruelty live on in us whenever we look away from unhealthy dynamics, convincing ourselves it is none of our concern. History is not past. It is alive in the smallest corners of our daily lives. And so the lesson of these humiliations becomes more urgent. Love cannot thrive in cages, whether golden or ordinary. Loyalty cannot be proven by suffering, whether in a royal court or in a kitchen argument. Control may give the illusion of security, but it corrodes from within, leaving behind only resentment and emptiness. The true test of devotion is not compliance, but freedom. The freedom to choose, to trust, to remain without being forced. This truth, so often ignored by kings, is still ignored by many today. Which leaves us with a question that cannot be avoided. If these patterns still live among us, what will it take to break them? Just as societies once had to unmask their rulers and demand accountability, perhaps we too must unmask the ways insecurity disguises itself as love in our own lives. Perhaps the final revolution is not in parliaments or palaces, but in our most private bonds, where the cycle of control and humiliation can finally be broken. And in that revolution, the legacy of those silenced mistresses may at last find its fullest meaning, not as relics of suffering, but as warnings that taught us how to build love without fear. Generations have a strange way of carrying wounds they never received directly. What happens in one age, behind palace doors or within the walls of a family home, does not remain trapped in that time. It seeps forward, disguised in traditions and sayings in the way love and loyalty are taught. The humiliations demanded by kings, the silences endured by mistresses, the rituals of fear and control, these became more than isolated stories of the past. They became patterns, passed down like heirlooms of pain, sometimes hidden, sometimes celebrated, often misunderstood. And in this quiet inheritance, we begin to see how power dynamics are not just political or personal, but generational. Parents shape children not only by what they say, but by what they model. A daughter who watched her mother tolerate constant suspicion may learn that love must always be proven. A son who saw his father equate devotion with obedience may grow up expecting submission from those he loves. These lessons are rarely spoken aloud, but they sink in like invisible ink, only revealing themselves years later when the child becomes a partner, a parent, or even a leader. The cycle continues, not because people wish to repeat the mistakes of their ancestors, but because the patterns feel familiar, and familiarity is often mistaken for truth. History offers countless examples of this inheritance at the highest levels. Monarchs raised in courts where humiliation was a tool of power often carried those same practices into their own reigns. A prince who saw his mother silenced by ritual trials might grow into a king who demanded similar proofs from his own consorts, not because he lacked imagination, but because he believed this was simply how power and love worked. The cruelty of one generation thus became the norm of the next, as natural to them as breathing. It is sobering to realize that many tyrannies were not innovations, but imitations. And this pattern does not belong to monarchs alone. Everyday families carry echoes of these dynamics. In some households, loyalty is still tested through sacrifice. If you really care, you will give this up. In others, silence is still the price of peace, with children told never to question the authority of parents or elders. These small daily rehearsals of control may seem harmless, but over time, they etch deep grooves into the way people understand love, trust, and power. A society raised on such lessons becomes vulnerable to larger tyrannies because people mistake submission for loyalty and control for care. There is a kind of tragic comedy in how often these inherited patterns are defended as tradition. Families might laugh off jealousy as a sign of passion or excuse control as cultural habit, never realizing that what they protect is the same theater kings once staged to hide their insecurities. When asked why they demand obedience, many reply simply, because that's how it has always been. It's a phrase heavy with history, as though the past were a wise ancestor rather than a warning. And yet, breaking free requires the courage to see tradition not as destiny, but as a choice. Generational memory also shapes culture at large. Nations that endured centuries of humiliation under insecure rulers often developed a sharp sense of satire, using humor as both shield and sword. It is no accident that some of the richest traditions of political comedy come from societies long oppressed by authoritarian leaders. The jokes told by peasants in taverns centuries ago carry forward into modern stand-up routines, memes, and late-night television. Laughter, passed down like folklore, becomes its own kind of inheritance, proof that even in the darkest times, people found ways to resist the weight of control. At the same time, trauma carries forward in more painful ways. Studies in psychology now suggest that unresolved fear and silence can be transmitted across generations, not through blood, but through behavior. Families who endured humiliation often raise children in environments shaped by caution, secrecy, and a distrust of authority. The grandchildren may not know the original story, but they live with its aftershocks. A trembling in the voice, a reluctance to speak truth, an instinct to comply. These are the quiet fingerprints of histories never fully told. And in this sense, the mistresses silenced by kings still speak, not through words, but through the habits of those who followed them. But inheritance is not destiny. Just as mistresses sometimes resisted, leaving behind whispers of defiance, so too do later generations find ways to break the cycle. A child who grows up watching control may, through reflection or sheer will, decide to live differently. A society that once bowed to kings may rise in revolt, demanding accountability instead of obedience. The very act of recognizing the pattern is often the first step toward rewriting it. This is why telling these stories matters. They shine a light on what was once hidden, giving us the tools to choose a different path. There is hope in this continuity too, for resistance is just as contagious as cruelty. Courage travels across time, passed down like an heirloom of another kind. A whispered story of a woman who defied her king might inspire a descendant centuries later to speak against injustice in her own home, The laughter of peasants mocking a tyrant might echo in the satire of a comedian skewering modern politicians. These threads remind us that while humiliation may be inherited, so too is resilience. And resilience, unlike cruelty, multiplies when shared. Which brings us to the deeper question: what do we wish to pass on? If history shows us anything, it is that every generation leaves a legacy, whether chosen or unchosen. We cannot escape the fact that our actions, whether of control, silence, or resistance, become part of the inheritance of those who come after us. The kings who demanded humiliating proofs left scars that lasted centuries, but those who resisted left seeds of freedom that still bloom. And so we find ourselves, once again, standing at the edge of history's stage, deciding which story we will hand to those who follow. The thread of humiliation and control does not only weave its way through families and cultural memory, it leaves its imprint on the very institutions that define justice and human dignity. Part 14 turns the lens outward, showing how the echoes of kings who once demanded cruel proofs of loyalty from their lovers shaped broader ideas of rights, law, and the meaning of respect in society. History's greatest reforms did not appear out of thin air. They were often born from the exposure of excess, from the recognition of patterns that could no longer be tolerated. The abuses that once seemed confined to private chambers eventually became catalysts for reshaping entire systems of governance and morality. One of the most profound legacies of these humiliations is the idea that no one, not even a king, is above accountability. The medieval and early modern world often accepted the monarch as God's chosen representative, but the exposure of cruelty shattered that illusion. If rulers could twist intimacy into instruments of fear, how trustworthy were they to rule justly? Philosophers of the Enlightenment seized upon these scandals as evidence of the corruption inherent in unchecked power. Thinkers like Montesquieu and Locke did not just speak of liberty in abstract terms. Their audiences already knew of mistresses forced into silence, of queens humiliated in public. The personal became political, and the political became philosophical, birthing ideas that would anchor the modern concept of human rights. The slow birth of legal protections for women offers another example. For centuries, women suffering at the hands of powerful men was dismissed as private or invisible. But as tales of royal mistresses and abused consorts circulated, they became metaphors for the broader vulnerability of women under patriarchal law. Campaigns for property rights, inheritance reform, and later suffrage often drew on the imagery of women degraded in palaces, reminding society that dignity denied at the top was dignity denied everywhere. It is not coincidence that movements for justice often began by invoking the most visible examples of abuse. If even queens were not safe from humiliation, how much worse was life for ordinary women? Curiously, the humiliations of kings also helped refine the concept of consent. In the courts of tyrants, devotion was demanded, not chosen. Love was measured by compliance, loyalty by silence. The very absence of choice revealed the absurdity of calling such acts proof. Over time, societies began to recognize that dignity lies not in forced submission, but in voluntary trust. This recognition seeped into laws governing marriage, contracts, and political allegiance. Where once oaths were wrung from subjects under threat, later generations insisted on the importance of free will. The modern insistence that consent must be explicit, whether in law or in intimacy, is in part a response to centuries where it was mocked or ignored. The evolution of justice systems also carries these imprints. Public trials, once staged as theater for kings, became cautionary tales about the abuse of legal process. Historians note how monarchs twisted accusations of disloyalty into performances that degraded mistresses and frightened courtiers. In response, later legal reforms emphasized impartiality, transparency, and protections against arbitrary accusation. The idea of due process, so central to modern democracies, can be read as a direct counter to the staged humiliations of the past. It was society's way of saying, never again should power be able to manufacture guilt for the sake of control. Even the language of rights bears traces of these histories. Declarations of the 18th century, from the American to the French, speak not only of liberty but of dignity. They insist that no person should be degraded, that all deserve respect regardless of station. These were not abstract ideals plucked from the air. They were born from centuries of watching rulers confuse control with love, obedience with loyalty. The humiliation of individuals became the soil from which the idea of universal dignity sprouted. It is a bitter irony, but a powerful one. The cruelty of kings forced humanity to articulate the principles of justice more clearly than it might have otherwise. The struggle, of course, was not linear. Even as ideas of rights expanded, societies continued to wrestle with the temptation to conflate power and control. The 20th century provides stark reminders, with dictators staging parades of loyalty eerily reminiscent of court rituals. Yet, even in those moments, the memory of past humiliations lingered as a warning. International charters after World War II, most notably the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, codified dignity as a global value. Article 1 famously states that all humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Behind that lofty sentence lies centuries of women silenced, of lovers humiliated, of courtiers forced to clap for cruelty. Their suffering, though often forgotten, is the reason dignity is now written in ink across international law. What is perhaps most fascinating is how these legacies continue to shape debates today. Conversations about workplace harassment, about coercive control in relationships, about privacy in the age of surveillance, all echo the same concerns. The lesson remains. Humiliation corrodes, whether inflicted by a king on his mistress or by a corporation on its employees. Rights are not abstract shields, but living protections against the very patterns history revealed long ago. Every time society debates the limits of power, it is, in some sense, still answering the question posed by those old humiliations. How do we prevent authority from disguising fear as strength? And this brings us to a deeper reflection. Perhaps the true revolution sparked by these stories was not political or legal, but moral. They forced societies to ask what kind of world they wanted to live in, one where loyalty is proven by fear, or one where dignity is the foundation of trust. It is a question we continue to ask, consciously or not, every time we decide whether to obey, to resist, or to reform. The courts of kings may be gone, but the theater of loyalty remains, waiting to see whether we have learned its lessons. And so, we stand at the edge of another question. If dignity is now enshrined in law, why do cycles of humiliation still persist? Why do modern relationships, workplaces, and governments still reenact rituals that should have been buried centuries ago? To answer that, we must go further still into the realm of memory and resistance, where the lessons of the past meet the challenges of the present, and where the voices once silenced may yet guide us toward a different future. The echoes of humiliation demanded by kings have not vanished into the distant past. They live on in modern life, disguised, reframed, and sometimes even celebrated under new names. The stage is no longer a throne room lit by torches, but an office under fluorescent lights, a home buzzing with smartphones, a courtroom, or even a social media feed. What history teaches us is that the theater of loyalty never truly ended. It only adapted, shaping the struggles of our time with new costumes and more subtle scripts. Part 15 brings the narrative into the present, exploring how cycles of control and humiliation continue to surface in debates about freedom, trust, and the fragile boundaries of power. Consider the modern workplace, where hierarchies still echo the old courts of kings. Some leaders, insecure in their authority, demand not only performance but devotion. Employees are asked to attend endless meetings designed less for productivity than for displaying loyalty. They clap for initiatives they know will fail, laugh at jokes that are not funny, and compete to demonstrate their allegiance to managers who crave reassurance. It is not so different from courtiers applauding humiliation centuries ago. The context has shifted, but the psychology is the same. Fear dressed up as loyalty, compliance mistaken for trust. And the cost, just as before, is dignity slowly eroded in the name of survival. In personal relationships, the echoes are sharper still. The language of proof, if you love me, you'll do this, remains a weapon as sharp as any royal decree. Partners may not demand dances on thorns, but they may insist on constant surveillance, location sharing, passwords surrendered, public displays of affection exaggerated for reassurance. These demands, much like the trials of kings, turn intimacy into a performance. And just as mistresses once learned that obedience never satisfied, modern partners find that no amount of proof ever cures insecurity. The craving for certainty is endless, and the cycle of demand and compliance devours the very trust it was meant to protect. Technology has only magnified these dynamics. Social media creates a global stage where the pressure to perform loyalty plays out daily. Politicians measure approval through likes and retweets. Influencers demand devotion from followers, and even friendships are strained by the expectation of public affirmation. The seen checkmark on a message can become a modern humiliation ritual, a reminder that silence is interpreted as betrayal. Kings once trembled at whispers in the court. Today's leaders tremble at hashtags trending against them. The tools have changed, but the fragility of power under scrutiny has not. At the political level, the pattern is even clearer. Authoritarian leaders stage vast parades, orchestrated chants, and carefully curated images of adoration. They insist on not only obedience, but theatrical devotion, as though applause could protect them from doubt. It is the same impulse that drove kings to demand humiliating trials from their lovers, the belief that loyalty must be proven, performed, and displayed, or else it is not real. History, however, shows us how dangerous this impulse is. When power seeks proof through fear, resistance always brews beneath the surface, waiting for its chance to erupt. What makes the modern age particularly fascinating is how these cycles are both resisted and perpetuated at the same time. On one hand, human rights charters, workplace laws, and cultural shifts emphasize dignity and consent more than ever before. On the other, the hunger for control resurfaces in subtler forms, hidden under layers of technology and cultural habits. A boss does not say, prove your loyalty, but creates conditions where disloyalty is punished in silence. A partner does not demand humiliation, but frames surveillance as care. These disguises make the cycle harder to see, but no less destructive. And yet, as in the past, resistance finds its voice. Just as satirical ballads once mocked insecure kings, memes and digital satire now pierce the illusions of modern rulers. Workers organize, couples seek healthier boundaries, societies call out manipulation when they see it. Each act of defiance echoes the same truth whispered by mistresses centuries ago. Loyalty without freedom is hollow. The more people recognize the pattern, the more they learn to resist its pull. History's warnings become a modern wisdom, teaching us that trust cannot be demanded, only given. Perhaps the most striking continuity is the comedy hidden within the tragedy. We laugh at the absurdity of kings who needed humiliating proofs of love, yet how different is it when someone panics over a delayed text reply or orchestrates applause in a boardroom? The comedy lies in our failure to see ourselves reflected in the past. But the laughter also carries power, for it exposes insecurity in a way no sword or decree can. Humor, as always, remains one of the most enduring weapons against control. The question, then, is not whether these cycles persist, they clearly do, but what we will do with the knowledge. Will we continue to disguise insecurity as power, mistaking control for love, obedience for trust? Or will we finally learn what history has been trying to tell us all along, that dignity cannot be forced, that loyalty is strongest when it is chosen freely, and that the craving for humiliation as proof is always a sign of weakness, never strength? The answer will shape not only our politics and workplaces, but the most intimate corners of our lives. And this is where the narrative bends toward its final arc. For if humiliation once toppled kings and reshaped nations, and if it continues to haunt modern life in subtler ways, then the story cannot end with recognition alone. It must end with transformation. Which leads us to the next and perhaps most urgent chapter. How do we break free from the cycle, not just as societies, but as individuals, so that the stage of loyalty no longer demands humiliation, but instead celebrates trust, choice, and the quiet strength of dignity?